There we go. Blur. Oh, here's my awesome background. For some reason, it is squished. That's pretty terrible. Guess I'm going back to blur. That's cool. All right. So, anyways, we're live. Thanks for attending Cannabis Track and Trace. This is a crash course in the compliance systems. There's a bunch of different compliance systems. This topic is mostly USA specific. So the first thing we've got going on over here is there's two primary vendors in the space and then a number of bespoke systems in use. The biggest player in the space right now is a service provider called Metric. Way back in the day, they started off as the compliance service provider for Colorado when Colorado passed way back in 2014, 2015. At that time, it was only Colorado and Washington, Metric in Colorado, and then the other vendor, BioTrack, was in Washington, and both of them had designs on, global domination. And as we moved out and had more and more legislation passed across the USA, these states, this is not a map of BioTrack versus Metric. This is places where we have some type of regulated cannabis infrastructure in place. The red states are where it's not allowed at all. Some of these states are operated by Metric. Some of these states are operated by BioTrack as the central government system that all of the track and trace reporting goes into. A couple of the states like Washington and Arizona and Vermont have their own sort of bespoke systems. And then also when you get into California, some of the regions in California have another bespoke system that compliance data needs to flow into, either for a county or some other administrative layer that they have passed there. Some states are medical only, some states are recreational, and will still have a centralized reporting system by one of those service providers. These service providers in the space, the bespoke systems, the Metric, the BioTrack, and in fact, all of these ancillary softwares that sit on top of those, full disclosure, OpenTHC is one of those, but there's 100 other service providers in that space, and we're all moving around nearly the same data. We're keeping track of trees, we're keeping track of the inventory, we're keeping track of test results, we're keeping track of deals that are done, either on a B2B or a B2C transaction. There's only very minor differences across these platforms in the way they would represent relationships between a plant and some inventory that is created, what sets and how much lab result data goes into one of these systems. The early BioTrack system tracked 4 metrics, the early, THC, THCA, CBD, CBDA. Early metric system also had those same kinds of limitations. The Leaf data system that used to exist in Washington but is no longer there ended up having a lab metric report that had a whole bunch of metals, a whole bunch of pesticides, a whole bunch of solvents, like more than 100 different result metrics that could be associated with, one of these inventory lab results. Pretty fancy. Medical versus recreational. There's some deals where you have to do a qualified patient lookup or things like this. There also may be limitations on the sale amounts. But they have all of these different regulations across all these different states and these enforcement systems. They also put into place those rules on labeling requirements, what kinds of stickers need to be on what packaging when. There may be some weight restrictions on what can happen, maximum weight of a production lot that can be tested, for example. What those testing requirements are, a more strict set of tests for a medical designation, things like this. And then also your packaging requirements. Some even require approval of the packaging, not enforced in the software, but the agency needs to make sure that your packaging isn't, appealing to minors or children. This is a quick example of the base data that is in every single one of these systems. I wish my system let me do a little bit of drawing on this while I was also in presentation mode, but every single one of them keeps track of a contact, either as some natural person, the person who's signing into the system and pressing the buttons, the administrative owner of the company, or perhaps even the qualifying patient who comes in and is making a purchase. They all exist as some type of contact-like thing in the universe there. A company is the business entity and the state, and then the license is the one or more licenses that company is granted by the compliance agency. So you might have a license to grow, or a license to transport material, or a license to process waste only, or a license to do testing, or a license to be a retailer, or depending on where you are, there may be 2 or 3 different kinds of licenses. Other places have, California, for example, like 13 different licenses or some nonsense like this, and a bunch of them that even have additional feature sets available to that license. New York has a very small micro license that offers feature sets that their larger licenses don't have. Inside of any one of those licenses, you keep track of a section or an area or a zone or a room. That's a logical location where the material is, and the systems allow you to designate a whole room, grow room. You could call it a table, you could call it a row, you could call it a rack on your shelf. It's a logical separation of where the material is in the system. The variety or cultivar or strain is, they keep track of the name of this material. It's all part of the material data that needs to get recorded. And then for some of the material in the system, you have to keep track of a product, the packaging details on the thing. This is a 3.5 gram package. This is 2 half-gram joints. This is 25 fluid ounces of soda with 10 milligrams of dose of THC dose per 1 ounce serving, or something along these kinds of lines. And building on top of that base data, we have some information about the crop or the individual plant. A lot of these systems require that each of your individual trees are tagged. In some cases, those individual trees have to be tagged with a label that you have to purchase from the state service provider. You can only buy their RFID tags. The systems have all seemed to handle the harvesting information slightly differently. That's where I'm taking my material from my crop, and I have pulled material off of the plant, and it doesn't immediately become inventory. Well, it can immediately become inventory, but the systems generally allow for a bit of a curing state to occur where the material comes off of the tree at 1,000 grams. I'm making up numbers. And then it sits in my curing phase for a minute, and there's an entry that this is occurring. And then later it enters the system on the inventory as the net result of that harvest. My 1,000 grams of wet material from the tree becomes maybe 3,000 grams of material that enters the system. And then that inventory gets converted and converted again as you go through the trimming process, as you maybe go through a packaging process, or maybe you have all of your flower and sticks and stems and you throw it in a blender and you press it into oil. All of that exists as the inventory. Then we have these other objects, the lab data, B2B transactions. I've sold these line items to this other licensee. And then finally, we have these business to consumer type of transactions. That's the retail sale, whether medical or recreational, whatever. So all that information, lots of it, all of that flows into these centralized government systems. If those systems are offline, which is rare but not impossible, the industry is sort of frozen. I can't enter new inventory into the universe if the system can't generate for me an identifier, if I can't register that this has happened. If I need to register a sale of my material to another licensee and the system is offline, I can't get the paperwork filed with the agency. If I can't get the paperwork filed with the agency system, I don't have paperwork I can carry in my transportation. That would not be legal transport of the material over to the other side, even if the system comes online while I'm driving. We got to wait for that to happen. Also, once these centralized systems are part of the government agency is not the people who are offering frontline support for these systems. It's outsourced to that vendor, Metric or BioTrack. And those vendors are there to offer some application support for the licensees. but they're also there to offer some API support for those third-party integrators, myself and a couple hundred other software vendors in the space. Thanks for hanging out with me. And then finally, these systems that are run by the government agency, generally that's a closed system. It was sort of a novel and wonderful experience in Washington state with some fairly strong sunshine laws. They deployed BioTrack initially, 2014, and they were providing some fairly rudimentary data dumps out of that system. You could get inventory detail, you could get crop detail, you could get transactional detail. In fact, it allowed the general public to see what was going on there and to be able to inspect some of that, and in fact, find anomalies in that data. That was fantastic. Here's an example of that closed government system. License A needs to do a transaction with license B. It's all got to go through this purple box in the middle, the system. If it's not there, if it's disconnected, they're frozen. License C, if they're not there, it's frozen. One thing that's pretty nice specifically for the retailers, license C perhaps in this example, is they don't have such a strict requirement for online transaction processing like the supply side actors or the laboratories do in these systems. The retailer has the feature set, those retail systems a lot of time can operate offline. They have a local knowledge of what the inventory counts are and can record a bunch of transactions. And then when that government systems come back online, then it can report those transactions. And in fact, the BioTrack and metric systems and the other bespoke systems all have a mechanism when you're reporting these B2C transactions to be able to report a transaction after it has occurred. And some of the bespoke systems let you do business to business transactions after the fact, but I'll wag my finger about that in a little bit. The next thing we've got actually is about that. Washington State has a fairly special case with the CCRS system that they have. Arizona, Vermont, Washington State have a special system for their cannabis reporting, but Vermont and Arizona are just built on top of inspector records review. Enforcement officer will visit your facility, look at records in whatever software system you're using, and we're ready to rock and roll. In the other systems, that's all going into the central agency, and the central agency can use that data on their enforcement side. In fact, they do. But Arizona, Vermont, again, a special case there. Washington has moved to a sort of centralized system, but it's a read-only, or it's a write-only type of system. The licensees just upload CSV files into the system that gives current information about their inventory and crop and business transactions and lab results and things like this. And it's a custom system. It's missing a significant amount of fidelity that exists in the BioTrack and the metric universes. But it does solve this one important problem. CCRS never goes offline because it's never really online. One of the nice things that happened when CCRS was deployed in Washington after the BioTrack one left, and then they went to Leaf Data, and now they're on this. One of the nice things is that all of the software integrators in Washington State had to get together, work together. We put together some sort of use the Leaf data, the previous system. We used some of its data schema for how we should move information around. And we started shipping JSON files around, send a link over to the other system, copy and paste the link in, upload a file to move data between the systems. And it's nice. It's distributed. It's federated. It is not as smooth as it could be, but it does have this really wonderful benefit of the distributed federated piece. If other systems are offline, you can still operate fully independently. Each of the licensees gets to make up all of their own identifiers for material, so algorithmic identifiers for the most part, and we can ship this data between each other and to the state agency independent of it. CCRS has a couple of other problems. It is, as I mentioned, it's a CSV upload. It's also a fairly simple CSV parser, so quoted fields and other fun stuff that are part of the CSV spec are not part of the specifications when dealing with CCRS. Any error messages or problems with the upload, the response is delivered through email, which sometimes can be delayed for a few hours. The initial rollout of CCRS did not have a mechanism for reporting business-to-business transactions, but the state agency was obligated to keep track of those. So they had initially had a web form on a Drupal-based website that we would fill out and upload information into, and that would do some process and generate a document. The legislation, again, says that this has to be done on a form that's provided by the agency. And so they're legally obligated. The law says they got to provide that. So they have a new one now, and we upload a CSV-like document with details of the transaction and wait for that system to give us the approval PDF document, again, delivered email. Again, sometimes, most of the time, in fact, it's delivered inside of a 15-minute window, but occasionally the system is slow. It appears to be like a batch processing system. Again, legacy technologies and all of the known problems that you would get with legacy technology. OpenTHC's vision for the future: fully distributed, fully federated type of system. Washington State, Arizona, Vermont. In fact, other places are already sort of showing that it's possible for a licensee or someone to be able to algorithmically generate an identifier that won't collide with somebody else's identifier. I say independent, universally unique identifiers here. These are things like UUIDs, a well-known specification. It gives you a 128-bit identifier. And there's so many of them, and the space for this is so big, you don't actually have to convey around to each other and to humans and on labels the whole 128-bit identifier. You can get by with just presenting sections of it, and in the very, very astronomically unlikely situation of a collision, well, we still have the whole identifier when we need this. If you're a technical person, you can think about this like referring to a GET commit with either the short 6-7 character bits of the hash or the full hash for the commit. The short one works really in a lot of places because the space for it, 128 bits in this case, is really, really big. The other wonderful, wonderful thing about distributed federated is all of these independent nodes. Your farm is independent, operating from the other farm. There's no situation where your farm can cause a problem in a centralized system that affects the other farm. Everyone can operate with or without the other parties even knowing if it exists. Each retailer is independent. Each licensee can be independent. The labs can be independent. They're not stuck with a system that if it is offline, everybody is frozen. And it's sort of, this is doing a lot of work here. Simple's doing a lot of work there. It's a simple process of just defining like a common data interface for moving those 12 common data blobs that exist in the universe around. And we can see commonalities in all of that stuff when you look at BioTrack API and data sets, when you looked at what Leaf Data had, what you look at what Metric has, Metric version 1 API, Metric version 2 API, BioTrack version 1, 2, and 3 of their API. You can also see that when you interact with other systems, there's other service providers in the state, other software service providers in this universe. Their systems offer APIs as well. Guess what they're moving around in those APIs? Product package detail, variety information, inventory identifiers, lot identifiers, tree identifiers. The same boring stuff. There's no fancy business proprietary data in these raw blobs. The process that your license has is not exposed through data sharing, either up to the agency or to other parties in a distributed network. And the same data model that works for all of this compliance data also works for business to business transfers. So license A needs to do some work, and they can send their special data blob over to the laboratory, and they can send a data blob that represents the same kind of transaction over to the reporting agency. And when they're done, the laboratory can send the lab result information right back to that licensee, independent of when or if they send that up to the regulatory agency. But because of the common data interface, the agency that only cares about 20 or 30 metrics gets their blob, and the licensee who's getting the test results can get their very detailed test results back in through the same mechanisms, just extended data on one versus the other one. Looks sort of something like this. License A, B, and C in this example are all able to communicate one-to-one with each other through, the magic of a distributed federated system, which I guess we'll have to detail in another show. And then independently, the purple lines there, all of those licensees can communicate their information up to the central reporting system. And again, with a good data model and a distributed federated type of architecture, third-party systems can integrate. Those third-party systems are, in your retail store, you got a menu that's a display. And then you've got to publish information from your POS into your weed maps or something. Common data model. Or it needs to go onto this other thing, or you're going to integrate with another service provider. Guess what? If they're moving the same data and the same common data model, base data, right? Lots of things have special attributes that they care about on feature sets. And, a good distributed federated protocol design would allow everyone to agree on the common, always necessary kinds of details, and still make room that a vendor could put their own special attributes on various pieces of data when they need to move it around. You wouldn't be blocking another service provider by extending the specifications, but you must do the minimum requirement of the specification. So OpenTHC, that's what we dream. We dream of a future where there is a distributed federated system that reporting data works with various systems that the licensees can operate, that works with a system that the agency runs, that is independent and allows these operators to, continue to work even if they're not online or not online with the reporting system. And another thing that is not very well demonstrated in this, but some licensees are not super connected to the internet from their facility. Their farm is maybe far away from services, or they're unreliable, or they're slow. Lots of other reasons. Sometimes a field is very large and you cannot have Wi-Fi at the far end of the field, and the nearest cell tower is not giving you coverage. This happens. With a distributed federated system, it makes it much, much easier to do operations on a laptop that's connected to nothing that you could enter straight away. And then when it's finally back in your office or in your facility, or you drive home from the farm and plug in, now it can affect that data change into the compliance reporting system, or even communicate the necessary data over to your third-party service provider, or to your laboratory, or to whoever else it needs to be. Crash course in cannabis compliance reporting systems. Come back next week.